This is the first revision video for the Lenin to Yeltsin topic of the Russian Revolution, which is for the Edexcel exam board for A-level. We're going to be looking at why there were two revolutions in Russia in 1917, the February Revolution and also the October Revolution, and we're going to look at 5 different causes of these two revolutions. The longest term causes are the social, political and economic causes of the revolution. So we're going to be starting with those. In the slightly shorter term, we'll be also thinking about the ideological causes and then the trigger for the February Revolution, which is the First World War. So in the 19th century, Russia was a country where the Tsar had absolute power. As a result of that, the political system was incredibly stagnant because the main motive of each of the Tsars was to keep their absolute power, and that prevented change from happening. They had limited influence from advisors, and there was a very small political class, so that limited change as well. Alexander II, who you can see was the first Tsar that we're going to look at, he was the father of Alexander III, the grandfather of Nicholas II, and he was the most, of those three, he was the most reforming. We'll look at some of his reforms in a second, but he was actually assassinated in 1881. And that led to Alexander III and then Nicholas II being very concerned about holding on to their power. So there's an autocracy in Russia. That's kind of the word that you would want to use to describe it. A system of government whereby one person with absolute power. But as time went on, and particularly once we get into the 20th century, people were starting to question whether or not this government was sort of serving them. There was a real belief amongst the peasants in Russia that the Tsar ultimately was there to protect them, and even if the Tsar's advisors were causing problems to them, if they could only contact the Tsar would be there for them. So Nicholas II, people really believed in this idea of a paternal Tsar, someone who would intervene for them. So in January 1905, the people of Russia, or some people in Russia, turned up outside the Winter Palace, where Nicholas II actually wasn't there at the time, but they thought he would be. And they went to protest against the conditions that they were living in. It was ultimately a hunger march. But once they were there, the palace guards opened fire, and they left 200 dead and 800 injured. And this event has since become known as Bloody Sunday. This really shattered the illusion of a Tsar who was loving and who was there to protect the people. The people were shocked that the Tsar's army had fired on peaceful protesters. And this led to a period of violence which has been since called the 1905 Revolution. So for around a year, there was violence all over the country in Russia. And Nicholas II really came very close to losing power. During that time, the key thing that allowed him to hold on to power was he was able to rely on the support of a significant proportion of the army. Even though there were mutinies in the army, he could rely on their support to deal with the protests by the end of 1905. He also suggested a range of reforms, and that included introducing a form of parliament which was called the Duma, and that was introduced, and that really was able to persuade the middle classes in Russia to support the Tsar, because they believed they would be able to turn the Duma into a kind of parliament like we have in Britain, or like we had in Britain at the time, which was controlled by the middle classes. So the middle class, the army, was sort of back on the Tsar's side, which enabled him to regain control. Initially, the Duma was quite a radical body. There were people within the Duma who wanted to reduce the power of the Tsar, to introduce reforms into Russia. But by 1907, the Tsar and his advisors had managed to pass new laws that would limit the influence of the peasants and the workers in the Tsar, and from that point, the peasants and the workers in the Duma, and from that point on, the Duma became a body that was mostly supportive of the Tsar and of the Tsar's power, and it wasn't a body that was able to introduce reforms or control the Tsar in any way. So in 1905, Nicholas II had a chance to create a sort of constitutional monarchy like the one that existed in Britain, but by reducing the democratic nature of the Duma, he prevented that from happening, and there was a huge amount of resentment between 1905 up to 1917 of the Tsar, no longer this belief that the Tsar was ultimately there to protect the people, and a resentment of the kind of watering down of the potential of the Duma. If you have a look at the social groups diagram here, you can see that the majority of groups in Russia were very, very small. Even the urban workers group, which this diagram is for 1860, so it had grown a little bit by the time we get to 1917, but the urban workers group is still about 5%. So a really, really small urban population. Russia is, and the Russian Empire is almost entirely an agricultural society. The most important group, or the largest group, were the peasants. They're listed here as the serfs because it was made before the emancipation of the serfs. But they were free peasants, but they had very limited opportunities because there was such limited movement. As is the case often in traditionally agricultural societies, there was very limited education and attitudes were very traditional. Order in the countryside depended entirely on the acceptance of authority. Authority came from three main areas. So authority from the Tsar, which, as you saw a second ago, was very strong, that authority, until 1905 when people began to question it. Authority from the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia was a very, very religious society, and the local priest would have been the most educated and the most important person in each local area. And authority also came from the Mer. There's a photograph of what the Mer might have looked like here. The Mer was a council of village elders. They basically were a group of the oldest men in the village, and they made key decisions such as allocation of land. They were the kind of group that had the most control, in the immediate sense, the most control over the lives of individual peasants. And they were also partly responsible for keeping that traditional attitude within the villages because they were older, they had an incentive to keep things the way they'd always been. So those aspects of authority, the Mer, they had very strong authority, but from 1917 and once the war broke out, in 1914, the other two aspects of authority, and particularly the Tsar, really started to break down, which is why we see the revolution build momentum very quickly in the countryside, and the agricultural revolution in 1917 was just as important as the one taking place in the cities. So peasants were fiercely independent. Although they accepted authority from the church and from the Tsar, they had very clear ideas about their own significance within the land. Most importantly, they believed that they owned the land they worked on. Even though they paid rent to the landowner in order to have the privilege to work on that land, they believed that the person who worked the land owned the land, and that became a really key belief in 1917. That was one of the things that drove the revolution on from the countryside, because they were seizing land from the nobility. Even those people in the cities had very close ties to the countryside. So we can't see the urban working class as completely divorced from the countryside. They kept very close ties with their village. They would often send money back to the village and might plan to go back there once they got a bit older, or go back there to start a family. So the ties between the city and the countryside were very strong, and Russia really was an overwhelmingly agricultural society. So the reliance in agricultural areas on that kind of personal authority of the Tsar and religious authority of the church in order to keep order meant that there was this situation where if unrest did take hold, it would be very difficult to stop it, because it was assumed that the peasants would always be loyal to the Tsar and to the church and therefore wouldn't rebel. But if rebellion did start to take place, there was no, or very limited police force, there was very limited government employees to stop it. So as economic problems in Russia became more and more significant, the reliance on that personal authority in the countryside became more and more inadequate in order to keep order. So we can see some of the economic problems here. So vast majority of people in Russia were agricultural workers, and the agricultural system was very inefficient. So there was always the type of farming that took place was subsistence farming, which means that each family grew enough food, just about enough food for themselves. They might also be able to get a little bit extra that they could go and sell in market, with the landowner's permission. They could go and sell it in market, but that was very limited. The vast majority of people would have made only just enough to survive. And that was partly because of the field rotation system. So you can see here like a map of kind of what it might look like to have 3 different large fields in Russia, and they've been divided into strips. So if you imagine each of those numbers applies to one family, so family number 1 has a strip or 2 strips in each field. That would have been chosen to make sure that the number of children within the family could have all been fed. So if you had a smaller family, you would have fewer numbers of strips. It was also designed so that if there was poor quality soil in one area, you might have some poor quality soil and some high quality soil. And you would leave some of your strips would be left fallow for the soil to recover, and then other strips would have been farmed. So it was designed to be fair, and the Mir allocated this land. But the problem with that was it was very inefficient, because if you imagine walking from each strip to, like, every day, you would have to maybe start on one strip and then go to the next one. There's a lot of walking, wasted time. But most importantly, because you only had small areas of land, there was never an incentive to invest in things like machinery, because if you've just got a small strip of land, there's no point in having a tractor or a combine harvester or anything like that. And because you've got a small amount of land, you're never going to make enough money to then invest back into the land. So whereas at this time in America and Britain, there were very large farms that employed agricultural workers, in Russia, everyone was farming for themselves, and so never got enough money to invest back into the land and to develop the farming system to make it more efficient. That meant that as the population grew in Russia, and you can see population growth here from 56 million to 98 million in a very short space of time, as the population grew, there wasn't enough food to being produced to keep up with that growth in a bad year. So if the harvest was good, people that would have enough to get by, but as soon as the harvest was bad, there would be famines. And in some cases, the famine would be just for a certain time or in a certain area. But in the 1890s, there were really, really serious famines in most areas across the Russian Empire. And you can see the number of deaths was quite shocking, so 400,000 deaths. And when you combine the lack of government officials in the countryside, that reliance on personal authority, with these economic problems, plus the harsh treatment of hunger marches in 1905, add all those things together, you've got a very large population of people who are feeling increasingly resentful of the situation in which they're forced to live, resentful of landowners, resentful of the Tsar, and this is kind of all building up to eventually in 1917 all of these problems coming to a head. The revolution couldn't have happened without peasant uprisings taking place in the countryside and without the Tsar losing control of the countryside. However, the political direction of the movement was determined in the cities. The leaders of the revolution who decided the course of the revolution were intellectuals who followed Marxism. So although they relied on the peasants rebelling and taking part in their revolution and making sure that the country was that the Tsar wasn't able to take back control of the country, they relied very much on the peasants, but it really was directed by these socialists in the cities. So socialism came to Russia when Marx's book, Das Kapital, was published in Russia during the 1880s. So most of Marx's writing would have been censored by the Tsar's government, but Das Kapital was like this economic, very heavy book that people, like the censors just assumed no one would read it. You can see Marx and Engels in this picture here. So Marx and Engels based their socialist theories on the suffering of working class people in England during the 1840s, in the factories in the northern towns of England, particularly places like Manchester. And they had this idea that the urban working class had lost the ability they'd lost control of the means of production. So whereas peasants in the countryside could grow their own food, they had some means of production, workers in the cities didn't have that. So they'd lost that sense of independence, and they were completely reliant on getting wages in the factories. And they were abused so much in the factories, having to work very long hours in very dangerous conditions for very low pay, that Marx and Engels were convinced that eventually this group of oppressed people would rise up and kind of have this violent revolution in which their masters would be removed from positions of power, and the workers would take over the means of production, so take over the factories. This was very much a theory of the natural progression of society. So Marx and Engels believed that society started off as a feudal society with landowners and people working on the land, and then there would be an industrial revolution, and after that industrial revolution there would be a socialist revolution, eventually leading to communism. So their vision for society didn't really fit within Russia in the 1880s. And so Russians came up with their own sort of interpretation of socialism. So they based their ideas on Marx and Engels, but they had different ideas of how it would work in Russia. So the largest group of socialists in Russia, and the earliest group, which develops in the 1880s and 1890s, are what became the party called the Socialist Revolutionaries. They were a group which basically came up with an idea of socialism rooted in agriculture. So in which the peasants would take control of the land, and they would therefore control the means of production, but that means of production wouldn't be factories, it would be an agricultural based revolution. And that was very appealing for people in the countryside who could read the writing produced by the Socialist Revolutionaries, and that was quite a limited number, but those who were literate. It was appealing to them because obviously they already believed that they owned the land that they worked on, and so that was just like a natural progression of getting rid of the landowners. However, the group that was to become most important, so the group that Lenin came out of, was not the Socialist Revolutionaries, but a party called the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was formed in 1891. And they were much more of a kind of traditionally Marxist party in that they focused their attention on the cities. And initially they believed that they would support the workers as Russia industrialised, and then once Russia had industrialised, they would then create a socialist revolution. So in the 1890s, they did things like form trade unions and assist with strikes in the 1890s. However, by 1903, there was a group within the party who were increasingly arguing that revolution needed to happen quicker. And this is when the party split. So in 1903, and you can see a picture of this kind of famous meeting here. There was a meeting in London because most of these people had to live in exile if they wanted to avoid imprisonment and potentially execution. So in 1903 they met in London, and Lenin puts forward this argument that actually they should be a party based of purely revolutionaries, that their main aim should be working towards that revolution. They should speed up the revolution. They didn't need to wait for an industrial revolution to take place before the political revolution took place, and that the party should become this kind of a revolutionary party, basically, where everyone within that party was working to create a revolution. Now, Lenin actually managed to persuade the majority of people at that meeting that he was right. That's not to say that the majority of socialists would have thought he was right, because there were lots of socialists in Russia that kept more quiet about their views or who weren't at that meeting. But he managed to persuade the majority of people at the meeting. And so that group who supported Lenin renamed themselves the Majoritarians, which was the Bolshevik Party. The people in the minority at the meeting gave themselves the name the minority group, which was the Mensheviks. And they argued that they needed to continue with the previous method of supporting the workers as the Industrial Revolution happened until the political revolution could take place. So the important thing to know about 1917 is that by 1917, most people in Russia who aren't in the elite and who could read are basically socialists. The majority of people were more leaning towards this socialist revolutionary argument of this very Russian type of revolution, which was based on the land. But there was this sort of small elite who believed that the revolution should be taking place in the cities. Within that, there was a difference of opinion, so whether the revolution should take place straight away or not. But most people in Russia who weren't in the elite by this point and who were interested in politics would have been seen as political radicals. And that obviously became really important in 1917 when there's this, the Tsar is overthrown and then they have to consider, okay, what type of government are we going to have? Everyone sort of knows that it's going to be a socialist government, because if there is democratic election, the majority of people are going to vote for a socialist party. And that's really important, because the middle classes who try and take power in 1917 in the February Revolution, they obviously don't want a socialist Russia. They want to have a democratic society similar to how it was found in Western Europe. So there was going to be this difficulty when the revolution happened in 1917, because the majority of the population by that point are socialists. Although there were many issues in Russia that we've already seen, the revolution would not have taken place in 1917 if it hadn't been for the First World War. That's not to say there wouldn't have been one later, but the First World War was the trigger for the 1917 revolutions. Ironically, the outbreak of war was seen as positive by Tsar Nicholas, as he actually believed that the war would create a sense of nationalism, and that the people would come together, would recognise his kind of personal authority again. But he was quickly shown to be wrong about that. In the early battles of the war, 2 whole armies were destroyed. And by 1915, land within Russia, so not just within the Russian Empire, but the country of Russia itself, was being taken by the Germans. You can see on the map in the bottom left, there's a red line. The most western red line shows where the Russian army started and how far they'd been pushed back by 1917. So a really considerable amount of land had been lost. And so in 1915, a lot of rumours started to spread, including rumours that the Tsar and his wife, who was of German origin, was actually in league with the Germans and that they were aiming to lose the war. And those rumours, combined with the loss of land, combined with the economic problems that always come with war, meant that there was a significant number of mutinies. And by February 1917, most of the army had mutinied by this point. So the Tsar had not only lost the ability to fight the war effectively, he'd also lost the main organisation which allowed him to keep control in times of crisis. So in 1905, after the Hunger March, which had turned into Bloody Sunday, the reason why he was able to get back control of the country by the end of 1905 was because he controlled the army. And once he's lost control of the army, he knows that is going to be very difficult for him to do. So in February 1917, women began protests against food shortages. So it was a women's march, went out to the city, into the streets of Moscow, protesting against food shortages. And more people joined in the protests, and they became bigger and bigger, and the cities became more kind of gripped with chaos, but they couldn't be brought under control because the army was no longer being controlled by the Tsar. And in fact, the army joined in with the hunger marches. And so faced with this situation where the Tsar had lost control of both Moscow and Petrograd, the 2 main cities, and he was no longer able to use the army to put down the protests, the Tsar abdicated. Initially, he abdicated on the condition that his son would be able to take over, but then he quickly realised that would be impossible. So the royal, the system of absolute power in Russia was ended. A provisional government was then established. So you can see in the top right there, the first provisional government that was introduced. The real problem with this provisional government is, well, there was 2 of them. They came from the middle class group, some of whom had been in the Duma, none of whom were socialists initially. And over time, more socialists joined, but they were only ever in the minority. And this provisional government was unelected, was the other key problem. So for many people, they seemed like they didn't represent the Russian population, because the middle class was very small in Russia. So the fact that they were mostly middle class didn't really seem to represent the country. But on top of that, they didn't want to hold elections until October. So they took over in February, and the elections weren't meant to take place until October. The idea was that would give them time to try and take control of the situation with the war, to try and take control of the food provision, like food shortages, get back control of the cities without having to worry about elections. But the problem with that is that they basically had no legitimacy. So the provisional government was always from the beginning going to face many problems. So they lacked legitimacy, they didn't seem to represent the whole population, and they also were in the middle of fighting a war that would be nearly impossible to win. They had to get soldiers to stop mutinying to actually try and defend Russian land. But all the soldiers wanted was to end the war. So there were lots of issues that they had to deal with. And the inability of the provisional government to deal with those issues is what eventually led to the October Revolution. I've summarised some of the problems faced by the provisional government here. One of the key issues that they faced is that the people in the countryside took the 1917 removal of the Tsar they interpreted it in the way that they wanted to, which was that there had been a revolution in land ownership. And as I mentioned before, there was no kind of government officials to manage the peasants. They relied on the kind of personal authority of the Tsar. So the peasants started seizing land from the nobility, and this led to absolute chaos in the countryside, and also a breakdown of kind of deliveries of food into the cities and to the army. So that exacerbated problems as well. The army continued to be in mutiny because just the removal of the Tsar wasn't seen as enough. They wanted to end the war. So there was no way of either sort of defending Russia from Germany, and also there was no way to deal with any unrest that took place in the cities because the provisional government didn't have authority over the army. They tried to establish it, but it didn't really work. Also, problems kind of got worse from the spring into the summer. So Lenin arrived back into Moscow in April, and he releases this April thesis. And in this April thesis, he basically puts forward the arguments of the Bolsheviks, which is that the war needs to be ended immediately, land needs to be shared out, and the revolution needs to happen straight away. So the socialist revolution needs to happen straight away. And he's the only kind of socialist leader who puts himself directly in opposition from the provisional government at this point. Other people, even other members of the Bolshevik party, are still trying to support the provisional government and accept the kind of revolution, the first stage of the revolution. And the leaders of the Mensheviks, the leaders of the SRs are trying to work with the provisional government too. But Lenin marks himself out as separate. And so from this point on, he starts to get more and more support from a very important groups within the cities, and those groups were the Soviets. So Soviet literally means council, and at the time there were peasant Soviets, there was soldiers Soviets, and there was workers Soviets. And the 1917 was a really intense period of political activity. If you were interested in politics at all, and an increasing number of people were, you would be regularly going to a meeting of your Soviet, where there would be hundreds of people packed into a room, listening to speeches, voting on resolutions and things like that. And Lenin's ideas were most appealing to the workers' Soviets and the soldiers' Soviets. And so lots of people got on board with this. And between, so in April, there were around 30,000 members of the Bolshevik Party. But by the time we get to October, there's actually 300,000 members of the Bolshevik Party. So obviously that's still a really small number considering how big Russia is. Like, this was always a minority party. But their popularity increases as Lenin makes his stance against the provisional government, because the provisional government was becoming increasingly unpopular with all these problems they were having to deal with. And that popularity plummeted even more with the July days, because in July, Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, he has chosen this guy called Kornilov to lead the Russian army. But Kornilov is quite conservative in his approach. He does things like try to reintroduce corporal punishment, which obviously is going to be really unpopular within the soldiers' Soviets. and with an army that's already mutinying, that's a pretty bad move. And when people rebel against Kornilov, Kerensky initially seems to be working with Kornilov, although he later kind of moves away from Kornilov. He still uses massive violence to try and deal with the July days, which is when the Soviets kind of rebel in the main cities of Petrograd and Moscow. So these protests against the provisional government are put down with a lot of violence. Lots of people are killed, and that also helps to increase Bolshevik popularity. So by the time we get into the late summer, really the real power lies with the soldiers and the workers' Soviets. They are the people who are kind of deciding whether or not to mutiny, whether or not to go to work every day. And so they're the ones who have the ability to get the war going, to control people, and also to get the economy going. So really they have power by this point. And the fact that they're not working with the provisional government shows that the provisional government has no power. And Lenin decides to take the opportunity to plan a coup for the 25th of October. I'm calling it a coup because it was very much the Bolsheviks trying to take control of the provisional government. And therefore, really, it was a political exchange of power. Obviously, we also call it the revolution. But in essence, Lenin was trying to replace the provisional government. And he was trying to do that crucially before elections were due to take place. So there were meant to be elections for the Constituent Assembly, which was going to decide the government going forward. And they were supposed to be taking place on November 12th. And so they really needed the elections. Lenin really needed to take power before those elections because he knew that the Bolsheviks would not win the election. So that's why it's very much a coup. He wasn't going to wait for the people to decide what they wanted because he knew that the majority of people didn't want the Bolsheviks. So at this point, Lenin plans this coup for the 25th of October. Kamenev and Zinoviev actually write an article in the Bolshevik newspaper encouraging Lenin not to carry out the revolution. And that gives Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, warning that the revolution is going to take place. And so Kerensky actually flees to the front at this point. So on the night of the 24th of October, Lenin actually goes to take over the Winter Palace, and we can see this happening here. It's difficult to know exactly what the nature of the revolution was because obviously it's become a massive part of Bolshevik propaganda and Communist Party propaganda. But historians think that between 10,000 and 15,000 people took place in taking over the Winter Palace. It wasn't a difficult job because the only people guarding the palace were the Women's Battalion of Death, which was a group of female soldiers who hadn't seen much fighting on the front. They were more a propaganda group of soldiers rather than an actual fighting group. So it was pretty easy to take over the Winter Palace. And when they got into the Winter Palace, the provisional government didn't try and defend themselves. They allowed themselves to be arrested. So it was actually pretty easy to take over. What actually happens, interesting, like a weird sort of fact of history, is that the Winter Palace had the largest stash of alcohol in Europe. So then what happened is loads of people, the soldiers, members of the Bolshevik Party, just the general kind of Petrograd population, went into the Winter Palace and took all the alcohol and proceeded to get very, very drunk for about a week. So that was kind of a problem that the Bolsheviks had to deal with as well. But while all of this is taking place, there is also political changes happening. So the key thing that happens after Lenin's taken the Winter Palace is that the Congress of Soviets meet. So the Congress of Soviets were already meant to have, that meeting was already been scheduled. And so everyone turns up from the different representatives from the Soviets come and obviously they're faced with this new event, which is the provisional government has been overthrown and arrested. So in total, there were representatives at the Congress of Soviets from 402 different Soviets. So 402 different factories, different kind of groups from within the army, all turn up, and they each send around about kind of like 1 or 2 delegates. So in total, there's 649 delegates. Of those delegates, 390 are committed Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks have a majority within the Soviets, which is why Lenin sees the Congress of Soviets as so important. But there are still lots of other delegates there who aren't Bolsheviks. So there are lots of Mensheviks and lots of socialist revolutionaries. So these are all people, workers and soldiers, who have come to represent their specific group, and they all have their own political ideas. And there's this big debate that takes place. And Lenin basically says there's been the second revolution, there's been a socialist revolution, you're either with us or you're against us. And at this point, the Mensheviks decide to be against them. So the Mensheviks say this is undemocratic, you've done this before the elections have taken place, you can't kind of just have a revolution, just decide to have a revolution without the support of the people. And so the Mensheviks actually decide to leave the Congress of Soviets. Sukhanov, who's one of the Mensheviks, looks back on this decision and is really kind of disappointed that he's taken this decision. Obviously, this is all in hindsight, but he actually says, by leaving the Congress of Soviets, we gave the Bolsheviks a monopoly of the Soviets, of the masses, and of the revolution. So he knows, looking back, that when they made that decision to leave the Soviets, they basically handed control to the Bolsheviks. Some of the SRs stayed, some of them left, and the Congress of Soviets basically elect a government. And surprise, surprise, the head of that government is Lenin. This government becomes known as the Council of People's Commissars. Commissars is a new word that Trotsky's come up with. It's kind of like comrades. It's meant to be that they are kind of the representatives of the people. And this Council of People's Commissars is what becomes known as Sovnarkom, so the government of the Soviet Union, which lasts right up until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. So the kind of crucial thing that takes place is that Lenin is able to take power before the elections, which means that when the elections do take place, Lenin has more power to kind of guide what happens from then. He removes the provisional government and really upsets the Mensheviks. So what he's kind of able to do is he's able to sort of take ownership of the Soviets. Already the Soviets have been moving towards the Bolsheviks anyway because of their radical nature, but he kind of is then able to guide the Soviets, which sorts of gives him control over the course of the revolution. What he doesn't have is majority support in Russia at all. Some of the most political people in Petrograd and Moscow believe that the Bolsheviks will give them the revolution that they want, but that doesn't mean that they are that the Bolsheviks have a majority at all. And this is very much a kind of political coup, a takeover by a minority group. But that kind of explains to you the cause of the revolution. Sorry, that was quite a long explanation, but hopefully that will make sense. So the next video that I'm going to put up is going to be on how Lenin consolidated power.